All right, let's go ahead and get started on a lecture on APR. So APR actually stands for annual percentage rate. And the first thing that I'll say about APR is that it's actually a lot more complicated than we're going to look at. There's a lot of different scenarios that you could come up with APR. There's a lot of different instances of this. We're gonna simplify it down quite a bit, but I think the basic thing to keep in the back of your mind is that APR is it's kind of analogous to an effective interest rate, and we've talked about that before. So we've seen that if you have an investment that you're compounding maybe monthly or for example, you can sort of compare that to what it would be if you were compounding annually, and that's what we've talked about with our effective interest rate. And so you're basically comparing, you're saying, hey, I've got an investment that isn't quite, an annual type of investment. It's not compounded annually. I'm going to compare it to that. And so with APR, it's kind of the same thing, but with loans. And so basically, what we have with is on a lot of loans, on almost any loan that you have, they can quote an interest rate uh, R that they give you. So you'll have a quoted interest rate, but in a lot of cases, there are actually sort of background fees, there's hidden fees, there's other things that are added into that loan that actually change what that interest rate really is. And so basically, what APR is it's basically just saying, all right, when everything is all said and done, what is the interest rate that actually reflects your loan? What interest rate are we really talking about here? Like they might tell you, hey, your interest rate is 5%. Oh, and but then we have a fee of $500 or something like that for whatever you're buying or borrowing for. And then, so yeah, sure, your interest rate is 5%. But if they're going to add $500 to the cost of everything, that in effect, you could think about it as, well, instead of thinking about it as a 5% interest rate and a $500 upfront fee, you could think of it as just changing my interest rate to be maybe a little higher than 5%, because they're just sort of actually charging you upfront fees. So it's kind of like effective interest where you're just saying, oh, all right, so you're adding these extra fees, you're adding some of these hidden things in there, you're being weird with all this sort of loan stuff. So what really are is the interest rate that I can expect to see in my loan? And that's really what APR is. As I said, it can be a lot more complicated than this, but we're just going to keep it fairly simple. And we'll sort of think about it in the sense of that there's just like hidden fees or upfront fees being added. Yeah. So APR, annual percentage rate, it's the interest rate that actually reflects really what you're getting out of this loan. So let's go ahead and actually start figuring out how to calculate APR. And the very first step of this is probably the most confusing, and it has to do with this variable that I'm going to call H. So I'm going to use H as this letter. And what H is, I'm actually going to write out how you would say this verbally. H is the finance charge per number of $100 bills financed. And I like saying this out loud because this verbal sort of statement right here is actually, you can actually convert it into a mathematical statement. And that's actually exactly what I have in the boxes right below it. So if I say that H is the finance charge per number of 100s financed, what I'm doing is I'm taking the finance charge, and when I see per, that means division. So I'm going to divide the finance charge by the number of 100s that I finance. And basically what this tells us is it gives us a ratio of our interest, which is just finance charge. Just those are equivalent phrases we could use, equivalent terms, finance charge and interest. So this H just tells us it's a ratio of our interest to how much we're actually borrowing. And so for example, let's say that I was borrowing $500. And let's say that my interest was equal to $300. So they're going to add, $300 of interest because I'm borrowing 500. So in effect, I'd have to end up paying back 800 in total. But if I'm borrowing $500, then we could actually calculate H, and we could say, all right, H is going to be the finance charge. It's going to be that interest divided by the number of hundreds that I'm borrowing, which in this case is just 5 because I'm borrowing 5 of those. This gives me 60. And that right there is a really high number in the case of H. So basically what we're saying here is, in this case, this large number tells me that my interest is quite high relative to how much I'm borrowing. If instead, and I'll try and squeeze this in here. So let's go ahead, copy. Let's kind of squeeze this right in here. I know this slide will look a little messy, but that's okay. Get rid of that guy. We don't need that. All right. So if let's say in a slightly different scenario, let's say that I had an interest that was $50, then my interest here, my finance charge is going to be 50. And the number of hundreds that I'm borrowing, the number of $100 bills that I'm borrowing is still 5. And so in this case, I get 10 for my value of H. And that's a lot lower than 60. And so that what that tells us is, it tells us that our interest is small relative to how much we borrowed. So basically, this formula right here, you're just taking a ratio of the interest to how much you finance. But we instead of just writing the amount financed here, we do it in this fancy way where we say it's the number of $100 bills that I'm financing. So if I was financing $1,000, that would be 10 $100 bills. If I was financing $1,500, that'd be 15 $100 bills, and so on and so forth. So that's our formula for H, but even more so than it being just a formula for H, that really is what H is. It really just tells us explicitly the ratio of the interest to how much we finance. And we just state that how much we finance in terms of the number of $100 bills that are being financed. This formula, you can rewrite it in a slightly different way. I'm not going to bother explaining why that's the case. I'll leave that to you if you feel like it, but you can rewrite it like this, and you can actually write it in terms of the amount financed. You end up getting the same thing, regardless of which one of these you use. It doesn't matter to me. Feel free to use either. They're equivalent. So there we go. So we've got this value of H, and really that's going to be our biggest thing for finding APR. Once we have H, we can calculate APR by using a table. And so we'll have this sort of cheat sheet table that we'll use, and let's take a look at it here. So this table is a little bit confusing because generally when you look at a table, any table, you're going to look at the rows here, and you're going to look at the columns here, and generally, you'll pick these out, and that'll give you a value in the table. But here we're actually doing things a little bit backwards. In this case, what we're actually going to do is we're going to pick a row. We're gonna find our number of payments first. We're gonna have that correspond to a certain value in this table, and then we're gonna go up and read off the APR in this top column. So this top column is really sort of the final part of this table. It is the APR. These up here are the APRs. They are the interest rates. So let's go ahead and let's consider sort of an example here where, let's say you were taking out a loan where the number of payments that you made was 30. So presumably 30 months, because these number of payments will be in terms of months. So let's say we're looking at a loan with 30 months. Basically, what we can do right off the bat is we can ignore almost all of this table. We can just look right here and only look in that red. We don't care about anything else outside of that table. Now, if you were to go through with the problem, and we haven't actually seen an example, but we will. But let's say you work through the example and you figure out this value of H that we've talked about. You figure out the finance charge, you figure out the number of 100s that have been financed, you get a value of H. that value of H is somewhere in here. And so what you would do is, let's say you got a value of H that was equal to 9.3. Well, I look in my 30 number of payments, my 30 months row, and I look for 9.3. And all of a sudden we notice that it's right there. I see 9.3 right there. So then I basically just go from here and I move right up and I see that my APR is 7%. And right there we found the APR. So we'll do an example of this and we'll come right back to this table and look at it more in detail. But just starting off, we've got number of months here. It's the number of payments that you have to make. In this middle section, we have values for H, and you'll notice that I label that with finance charge per $100 if I'm not financed. That is the definition of H. And then we use those two things in conjunction with each other to give us an APR. So let's go ahead and look at an example here. Let's say that Taylor wants to get the transmission on his car fixed, and the bill is $1,900. He's able to pay $400 up front as a down payment, and then he's going to finance the rest of the payment for 2 years, and then I'm going to actually give you his monthly payment here. So we can use sort of the terms and stuff from our previous lecture on installment buying to figure some things out here. First things first, the amount financed. That's going to be how much he has to pay from day 2 onward. It's how much he's borrowing to pay for this. And so that's just going to be the 1,900. That's the price of the fixing the transmission. And then I'm going to take off the 400 that he paid on day 1 to find out that he owes $1,500 more dollars. And that's what he's going to borrow. He's going to take out a loan to pay this $1,500. So to pay this $1,500, he finances that over 2 years with a monthly payment of $67.34. So basically, what I can do is I can figure out how much he paid over the course of this financing. And so what we'll say here, let's go ahead and look at that. It wouldn't quite be the total installment price because I don't want to include the 400. But let's just say, I won't give it a name. We'll say $67.34 times 24 months, because it's over 2 years and his monthly payment is $67.34. So he banks 24 of these payments. That's going to give all of his payments adding up to 1616.16, $1,616.16. So that's how much he paid during the time of this financing from day 2 onward. But as we've calculated, he only was supposed to pay $1,500. And so what we're seeing here is that the finance charge, that's how much extra he paid. That's the interest. The finance charge is just equal to how much he actually paid over the lifetime of this loan. And then I take off of that, I subtract how much he was supposed to pay, which is that $1,500. So basically they're saying, hey, we'll let you borrow $1,500, but you're going to end up paying $1,616.16. He says, all right, that's fair. Because I don't have that $1,500, I'm borrowing it. I'm going to pay $116.16 extra. And that is interest. That's a charge for financing. So we now know the two things that we need for in fact our value of H. So we know how much he financed and we know the finance charge. Let's go ahead and calculate that. So what we've got here is H equals finance charge divided by number of hundreds financed. I'll just write fin dot just to be short. All right, so if we're trying to calculate H, we got our finance charge of $116.16. And we're going to divide that by the number of $100 bills that he financed. Well, we know that he financed $1,500. We have that here in the red. So the number of 100s that he financed would be 15. Because if I was counting out $100 bills, I would count 15 of them, and then that would get me to my $1,500. So if I divide this by 15, I can actually find a value of H. The units here are dollars. I'm not going to focus Y on that. I'm not really going to focus on that at all. That's okay. So we've got our 7.74. That's our value of H. And basically here we're done. Now we can just go right on back to our table. We have our value of H of 7.74. I'll go ahead and write that up here. H equals 7.74. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to just look for 7.74 anywhere in here. I want to make sure that I'm looking at the particular row in question. And so we hopefully remember that he had a 2-year loan. And so that's going to correspond to 24 monthly payments. So I want to be looking at this row right here. And so let's go ahead and just single that row out. Let's look right at the 24 right here, and let's only look at this row. So I'm looking for 7.74 in this row, and so I come over, I come across, and I start looking at all of these for 7.74, and right in here, I start to notice that I actually skip right over 7.74. And this is sort of a point that I want to make here. You're going to calculate a value of H on these problems, and it may not exactly show up in this table. For our purposes, you can sort of just estimate, for example, let's say our H was 7.46. You could just round it and say, hey, this is our value of H. So let's just assume it's here, and let's go up. So in this case, 7.74 seems to be kind of approximately right smack dab in the middle of this 7.45 and the 8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up, and I'm going to look at both of these. I'm going to say, well, you know what? Maybe my APR is right smack dab in the middle of those. And I'm just approximating here. I'm just going to say that it's about 7.25%. That'd be a good enough answer. We could say, hey, it's about 7.25%. So just be careful. If your value of H isn't exactly on this table, you may have to round a little bit or kind of guess, hey, it looks kind of like it's right in the middle there. And you can just kind of estimate. And so right there, we found the APR. We found this 7.25% right there. And that's a way that we've found our interest rate, our APR, our true interest rate here, given his monthly payments. One last thing I do want to mention here is actually on this calculating H. So let's go ahead and look back here. In this example, we had a nice round number here for $1,500 of the amount financed. And so when we went to calculate the number of hundreds that were financed, that was really easy. We could just say, hey, what if we're just adding up, $100 bills? We're just counting how many $100 bills there are. That'd be 15. But let's say I gave us an amount financed that was a little bit more complicated. So what if I had amount financed equals 1,550? So 1,550. Well, my number of 100s financed, now we run into an issue here, because if I just were to count whole entire $100 bills, I'm not going to get there perfectly, because I would count up to 15 of them and I'd be at $1,500, but now I'm left over with $50. And so in fact, I actually need half of $100 bill right there. And we could even change these numbers. I know 1,500 might be a little hard to keep sort of in the head. Let's say that we had 650. So if I count 6 100s, that gets me to my 600. But then I have $50 left over, and so I need actually 6 and then a half of 100. we could continue on with this. Let me copy and paste this a couple times over and over just so we can see it in several different cases. All right, so if we had an amount financed that looked something like 473, then you could say that the number of hundreds that you would finance would be, well, we definitely have 4 $100 bills. That would get us to 400. But now I need to get $73 out of 100. So I'm going to write 73. And then we could keep going. Maybe my amount financed is $86.22. And here I'm not even quite fully at a full 100. So if I wrote 1 here, that's already too much. And so it turns out here that we actually just need a part of this. We need less than 1. We need 0.8622. And what you might be noticing here, this sort of trend, is that basically to get the number of hundreds financed, I'm just dividing the amount financed by 100. So I'll go ahead and write this out. Number of 100s financed equals the amount financed divided by 100. I might look a little weird, but it's okay. So that number of 100s financed is just equal to the amount financed divided by 100, and we'll see some other examples of how this amount financed is a little bit more complicated, more along the lines of these, as opposed to just that simple like, hey, 1,500. That was really easy to count. So last little note there. That's basically APR. As I've said, it can be a lot more complicated, but we're just going to kind of go with this sort of this simple method of looking at it, where we're just going to kind of adhere to that table that we used, and just kind of go with what that says and live with it. All right, that'll be it for the lecture.